Welcome to another edition of Women in the Arts Network Zoom. This week, my co-host is Kim McMillan. She brings a panel of extraordinary Black authors of science fiction. They're discussing Black speculative fiction. It's a very interesting conversation. Let's listen in.
Science, well, like I said, my parents read to me every night when I was a kid. So I grew up with this very robust background in all kinds of books, whether they were just children's books, and then we advanced to more to different material as I got older. And so I always grew up just, getting a bunch of different types of things that made me love reading. In terms of sci-fi, it's actually kind of funny. I didn't read a lot of science fiction. I ended up watching a lot of science fiction films. It was something that my family collectively liked to do because my dad was into comic books. And so I always grew up surrounded by comic books, surrounded by, we always joke about this as 90s kids. We had the best cartoons. They were better than everybody else's. So, growing up with
differ.
I know. That's why we joke all the time. We fight with the 80s kids and the 70s kids a lot in terms of who had the best cartoons growing up. But that was a big influence. So, all of the Marvel Comics animated shows like Spider-Man and like some of the, it was mostly Spider-Man, the X-Men series as well. We used to watch Transformers, Beast Wars together. Most of it came from, I would say, TV shows and films like The Fifth Element. The Fifth Element is one of my all-time favorite films. I've seen it thousands of times by now. I know all the words and everything. So I was going to say that's really where my love of science fiction came from. It really was, I would say, based on comic books, TV shows, and movies, not so much in writing. Because one thing that I had noticed when I did select a little bit of science fiction is that I found that a lot of the more famous ones were kind of dry. So it would have a really big concept, and it was, of course, written very well, but they weren't often character-based. And I found that was something that's how I am as a person. You can give me a great concept and I'll still enjoy it, but I won't take it home with me, like personally, if you don't have me connect to your characters in particular. And that was one thing that I struggled with when I was kind of reading certain science fiction. Now it's gotten a lot better now that we're in contemporary society. Like I said, when I was younger, you kind of got, suggested the same names again and again. And I was like, I'm not really gravitating towards that. And that's something that I took to heart when I wrote my own science fiction series, is that I was like, I want you to immediately be invested in the characters themselves. The concept, of course, is awesome and cool, and that's what's going to keep you there. But I think that it's always important to have the heart of the character, someone you care about. So no matter what's going on, even if the setting changes, if there are different things, that you're always invested in them. But I would say that's where my background and love of science fiction came from.
Can I ask you a question? And when you actually develop your characters, because I've known some science fiction writers and some science fiction illustrators, and they all tend to have this they have this relationship. They present this relationship between what's actually real and terrestrial with what's in their mind in terms of science fiction. I have a student that years ago that did a series, and she kind of based it on I guess a marrying of the human form and the animal form and anthropology. And she kind of melded everything together into her strip. She's an adult now, I think she's in her late 20s now, but she developed this strip when she was, she had to be 15. She was my best student. I've introduced her to Kim. I don't know if you guys connected. Kim, we'll talk later. But what she did is when she was a really great artist, illustrator, and she had this story in her mind. And I'm very intrigued by what in your psyche would actually have you gravitate towards science fiction, because you have to kind of, go through some morphing in your mind of what's human, what's real, what's animal, what's machine. It's like I'm fascinated by that process. Maybe you could talk to us about that.
Sure. So for the series that I do, which is the Of Cinder and Bones series, the basic premise is that dragons used to exist as real creatures in our world, same as all the other species of animals. And they were hunted to extinction during this period where everyone became obsessed with dragon hunting, and they killed literally the whole species. And so there's two MIT scientists, Dr. Rhett Jackson and Dr. Kamala Anjali, and they figure out how to clone a dragon and to bring the species back, but only for the purpose of conservation and study. It wasn't for any exploitive reasons whatsoever. It was because with them being killed so far ago, this was back in the 1400s, for goodness sake, there was so little about the creatures they were able to know. And so they wanted to bring them back to see what would be the impact and what they could learn from them. And then, of course, immediately it goes wrong because somebody steals the dragon for the purpose of exploiting it. Because that's how life works, the opposite of whatever the plan was. So
okay.
I bring that in to say that the reason the idea came to me was like, I like the idea of, I'm very respectful of nature. I don't know if it's because my mom's a nurse. And so I've always like believed in harmony and health and things like that. And I thought that dragons have always kind of been cast in usually like a villain sort of role. We're used to hearing stories about, dragon hunters going out there and killing them being a menace and things. But actually, if you shift away from Western mentalities, dragons and reptiles in general are actually very positively portrayed in Asian cultures and Indian cultures and African culture, a lot of that. So I thought that was something that I wanted to bring into it personally, is to cast them in a light of hard science. So I also got to do a bunch of really fun research about how can I make a dragon real? What would be their traits? What would be their behavior? Where would they live? What kind of food would they eat? All of those different things I got to bring into it because, like I said, I've always really enjoyed nature as a whole and just learning about it. And again, the fun process of figuring out the scientific side of it, I think, is what drew me to the science fiction angle as well.
Oh, thank you. What you have to say, it really relates to Glenn. Because Glenn, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what brought you into the field of, or the genre into science fiction, but once again, Dragon's Air, you create a whole universe with literally a whole language. And so can you talk to your whole idea of why you decided to work the whole theme of dragons, as well as how you got into the field of Black speculative fiction, Glenn?
Of course. So, I'm probably a little bit older than Kyoko, but I started off with comic books, and of course, not reading them, but looking at the pictures when I was, 6, 7 years old, because I couldn't understand all those words. But I started drawing the characters and started imagining what the characters would do. And, of course, I love the cartoons of the Avengers and Spider-Man, that sort of, stop action kind of stuff they did in the 60s when they didn't have a whole lot of money to really animate. But I graduated to science fiction with Andre Norton's Operation Time Search, Larry Niven's Flight of the Horse. And then, I got really hungry for science fiction. They didn't have a lot of science fiction books in the library. So when I got my hands on anything mystical or anything like that, a lot of times I'd keep the book, I just pay for it, at the library of the school. I said, yeah, I lost the book and I just pay for it. So I'd have the book. And, I've got 3 or 4 of those even now in my library from when I was a kid. Yoruba myths and legends, that kind of thing. But I think that I really got hooked when I started reading Asimov's Foundation trilogy, the Dune series.
Oh, yeah.
And then I began to ask myself, where are we in all these amazing stories with really interesting character development? And I didn't discover, one of my own alumni, Chip Delaney, as a science fiction writer until much, much later, after I actually started writing. And I was introduced to Octavia Butler's work, when I was working on publishing my own first novel. When someone told me that, there are only 3, African-American science fiction writers at the time. Of course, this was a white individual, and he didn't have the background of a lot of the speculative fiction that had already existed that wasn't labeled classic science fiction, air quotes going on there. So I began writing what I thought we were missing. And I get into characters. I want to know what motivates them. I want to know how they interact. I like subtext when I'm looking at characters. So I wrote, my story first as Eminent Domain under my pen name, J. Cameron Time, back in the mid 90s. I developed that much later because I'd given up writing for a while. And I published it as Dragon's Air, which got picked up by Outland Entertainment. And they're now going through the editorial process. I'm hoping that it'll come out this fall or something like that. But with publishing, you never know. But it's interesting. It's Dragon's Air, H-E-I-R, and again, it's completely different from Kyoko. We are both, surrounded by a background of Dragon's Air, A-I-R. Which I talked about in the novel for the Aurora Borealis. But my story starts with a character who is of dinosaurian origin and not what we think of as dinosaurs. So she's warm-blooded. She is covered with a pelt that looks more like fur than like feathers, no scales, highly intelligent, very active. And developed a highly technological civilization with many other species 65 million years ago. And her species came back to Earth, not expecting to find anything living at that point because they thought Earth was a dead husk. And they find that the dragons, which were called something else, but led by an individual by the name of Dragon, which is why it's Dragon's Air. She's the story unfolds as she interacts with human beings and learns about them as they fear her and her species, and so on and so forth. There's plenty of conflict and relationship building. Individual characters are always fun to create. But that's the way I sort of got into it. I've enjoyed the newer Marvel movies because of the character development. I love the special effects, but that's so superfluous. The development of character is what I really like. And I've always been insulted, and I think a lot of people have. I've always been insulted by the publishing industry and Hollywood's attitude. There's certain things that are too cerebral for the public to enjoy or appreciate. It'll turn them off. You'll lose them. It's too complex. That's what we want. I mean, we need to exercise the gray matter a little bit. That's one muscle that we just don't get enough of.
I wanted to also say that we have what unites everyone here is the anthology Black Panther Tales of Wakanda, edited by Jesse Holland. And what is wonderful is I've read the short stories, and what I found with those short stories is that each of the authors brings timely issues, from Kyoko M bringing the issue of the trafficking of women, from you looking at issues, Glenn looking at issues, something we consider a myth sometimes, Atlantis, or the idea of slavery. We somehow don't put Atlantis and slavery together, but the way you did it was absolutely excellent. And then we also have another author, Troy Wiggins here, who's also in the anthology Blackfire. Excuse me, I'm working on another anthology, but Black Panther Tales of Wakanda. And what Troy does is he uses comedy, and he also uses he also uses high tech. And that is so much a part of Black Panther anyway. But Troy would like to just say a bit about how he got into science fiction, Black speculative fiction. Troy, you want to say something?
Yes.
Yes. Hello, everyone.
Hey, Troy.
Apologies for. Hey. I'm really glad to be here. Really glad to see some of my fellow contributors to the Black Panther Tales of Wakanda anthology. I'm making my way through the anthology, and I'm loving everything that I'm reading. I'm loving all the takes on the character and all the unique ways that each writer is putting themselves into that work. It's really a spectacular anthology. I have enjoyed also listening to how different people get into this field and how different people come to doing this work, this writing work, which has, I think, as Glenn pointed out in his kind of recounting of his path, often fraught with a lot of petty discrimination, a lot of dream killing from people who don't know better, and a lot of having to navigate the publishing industry, which is, a capitalist enterprise that doesn't always consider the different ways people bring themselves to their art. And so knowing all that, I still enjoy being a writer of speculative fiction and a Black writer of speculative fiction that focuses on, specific Black experiences. And so I came to science fiction, fantasy, and speculative fiction in a lot of ways that have already been outlined by my fellow panelists. I am also a 90s kid. So I definitely watched the 90s Spider-Man series, the 90s Fantastic Four series, the 90s Iron Man series. But I also was one of those children who was influenced by another great cultural shift in the 90s, which is anime and video games that came from Japan. And so very interested in the different ways that anime and that Japanese role-playing games brought some of these different perspectives to bear. For me, who was a Black kid growing up in the South, I didn't have these perspectives before, these takes on what power looks like, on what's possible in the world, and on what kinds of things magic and our heritage can do for us, and having this deep sense of history. All of these things that were present in these cartoons and these books and these video games from Japan that I was playing. And I'm not unique in it at all. There are tons of people, Black people, still today who really like anime and tie it to their love of speculative fiction. And so being a young Black person growing up in the South, definitely getting exposed when I decided to start in exploring speculative fiction to the Heinleins and to the those earlier writers, also to Ursula Le Guin, who was really formative in some of my understanding of speculative fiction's power to help reshape the world that we live in. Octavia Butler, same thing. I was introduced to her in high school by our advanced placements English teacher, who our textbook for AP English had an Octavia Butler story in it. It also had a story from Ann Petrie, right? And so I was able to, in high school, which I was very fortunate to experience work from Black writers in the speculative tradition and in the classic literary tradition, which informs a lot of how I approach speculative fiction as well. Also a huge fan of Samuel Delany, who I got exposed to in college. But my early formative stuff was really some problematic folks, right? I love Conan, I love Tarzan, I love those pulp novels that I could get from the library, my school library. I love comic books, a huge comic book fan. And I also liked hip hop music, soul music, music from Japan that I would hear on animes that I like. All of that stuff melded into a kind of aesthetic and an artistic style that I like to incorporate into my work, which does investigate themes that are important to African Americans. And so, yeah, just really, some of that also comes out in that story in different ways as well. But yeah, there are a lot of different influences and different kind of steps on my path to deciding to write speculative fiction. But it's really those authors like Octavia Butler, like Samuel Delany, like Ursula Le Guin, currently like Adrienne Marie Brown, and some other authors who really like focus in on like, let's use science fiction, fantasy, speculative fiction to investigate these really deep problems in our contemporary society and figure out, using these tools, the great tool that speculative fiction gives us, which is the tool of our imagination, to really investigate and see how we can create new worlds for ourselves and for others, and share space on this planet.
And what you're saying is really important, because the way that you write is how, through your own experiences or through what we live in. Like I noticed, Kyoko, you wrote about trafficking of females, and that is such a large issue right now. Glenn, you all took on a major, what I consider a major issue that affects the Black community. From Troy, you took on the issue of white supremacy. And Glenn, the whole issue of, to me, how slavery, even to this day, is affecting us.
Yeah.
And yeah, if you all we could talk about that. I think what you did was very important.
I think I may have, I'm often a little subtle in my writing, I think. So one of the biggest parts of my writing was how a superpower like Wakanda reconciles with some of the evils that were visited upon indigenous peoples around the world, particularly from West Africa. And recognizing that it's a superpower that had to remain secret and hidden, how would you influence an industrializing world that was growing from using fossil fuels to using nuclear power, and how that might impact the world and upset the balance of power between the superpowers? And talking about how they allowed slavery. It has often upset a lot of African Americans how this could have happened. Why the wise, powerful, and advanced systems of Africa, political systems of Africa, could have allowed this. Why couldn't they have stopped it? Why didn't they come after? We realized that it happened during a lull in technology and a lull in unity in Africa. The whole Middle Passage and the taking of so many slaves. But in my story, I wanted to come up with an alternative, that this was a way of seeding war dogs all around the world to sort of curve the development of dangerous technologies and keep Western civilization from destroying the world and destroying the balance of power and poking the bear, so to speak, of the Atlantean Empire. I cite one of the war dogs, the Wakandan spies, as Harriet Tubman, and how the Black Panther of 1912 was lamenting the impending death of Harriet Tubman in the beginning of the story. It was sort of subtle. It sort of passed through. If you don't recognize that Harriet Tubman was also known as Moses as a code name, it might have slipped right past you in there. But those are some of the things that I think about when I'm creating stories.
Thank you, Glenn. What you had to say was very important. Kyoko, what made you decide to use the issue that has plagued our entire world, and use it in such a way that the female voice is really heard, and we see that the child, we see that you empowered her at the end. So what made you use those types of themes?
So one thing that's always been very important to me is I was raised by my mom's side. We all grew up. So basically how it happened is my grandparents, my mom's parents, moved down here and had a house in Riverdale, Georgia. And we moved, like when my parents had me, they're both from DC, and they ended up going to FAMU. And then I think they moved up here to be closer to her side of the family. And so a lot of the cousins, my aunts, they all moved here to Riverdale as well, to be around each other, because we have this really, really huge sense of community on my mom's side. They're all involved in each other's lives. They're all very, very compassionate, intelligent people. And so I was always raised around intelligent, strong, compassionate Black women. And that was something that I really found myself when the Black Panther movie came out, was seeing that beauty, that power, and especially because they were dark-skinned and African women in particular, which is not a dig at any American or lighter-skinned people, but it's very difficult for brown-skinned and darker-skinned Black women to be given roles where they're central to the plot and they're not like a sidekick. They're not, cast as very masculine or kind of just the sassy best friend, that sort of thing. they were cast in this light of showing their power, but also showing how much they care. Like Okoye is this force to be reckoned with, but at the same time, you saw the softness in her. You saw the loyalty she had for T'Challa and for the other Dora and for everyone she protected in Wakanda. You saw like that playfulness that she had as well, that the love and the compassion that she had in her. And that was something that I've been fortunate enough to know my entire life. And I really wanted that to come across in this particular story, because it is about, I mean, there's action and there's, threatening a bad guy whose fault this is, and, all these other really great elements. But at the same time, I didn't want it to just be a straightforward action thing or, kind of a mystery as she's trying to figure out where the kid is, because there's so many other sides to Black women. And that's what I wanted to portray. I really wanted to give like this full 3-dimensional examination of not only Black women, but Okoye in particular, because like I said, it was one of the first times we really got this excellent look at what Black women have always been, but don't always get that sort of portrayal, especially because it was in a science fiction story. Like I said, there's a lot of Black women you can name and fictional Black women characters that we have loved for decades. But this was one of the first times we really got a centered spotlight on that type of character in a science fiction setting. And so that was really what motivated me to bring that there. And then again, to discuss the trafficking, because it's something that I think people don't think happens in modern times anymore. I think they kind of think that, oh no, it's not that serious. I don't really think it's going on, but it is going on. It's going on in Africa. It's going on different continents. It's definitely a problem in the US, especially recently. We're hearing more reports of it going on. And so I wanted to make sure that I was able to kind of just get that reminder of, this isn't in the past, it's still happening, and it's important to be focused on it.
And I was just so heartened by the issues that you all brought up. Troy, when you talked about white supremacy right in the middle of what we're seeing happen to George Floyd, what happened to George Floyd, I felt like your piece was really vital. You use humor, you use technology, but it was very clear there was a straight line that white supremacy, racism needs to be dealt with in the United States. Can you talk about that and why you chose to make that so clear in your writing?
So first of all, my story is called What's Done in the Dark, and it is very much a continuation of conversations that have happened in the Black Panther comics, right? So in the Black Panther comic books, the characters have not always shied away from depicting some of the difficult conversations that have to be had about Wakanda and Wakanda's place as a fictional, African superpower to Glenn's to some of Glenn's thematics in his story, right? And they also are a country that has foreign policy, that has diplomacy, that uses spies, that have influence, political influence and social influence on the world stage. And so it's really, I think Wakanda is kind of fertile, especially in the hands of Black creators, to investigate some of the more pressing things that are going on in our time that a superpower like Wakanda, with its advanced technology and its really deep and interesting culture, and especially its warrior culture and its military culture and its kind of sense of justice that it applies to itself as a nation. There's a lot of fertile ground to explore that in different kinds of media, as we see from the stories that Kyoko and Glenn have written, right? And so for me, honestly, just as a Black person living in America, and this I specifically call out a Black person living in America because Black people have experiences globally, right? But as a Black person living in America right now, and as a Black man living in America, there's a specific perspective that I have on the impact that white supremacy has on African Americans in America, and I fully believe that white supremacy is something that has to be dealt with decisively. And honestly, in Wakanda, T'Challa is a very decisive character. And it's funny because we see glimmers of the really capable, really, and I mean this politically, right? Not like in regard to his like superpowers and his skills as a fighter and a commander, but like as a politician, as somebody who has a lot of resources to his name, we see some glimmers of how he uses his resources and the people that are a part of his resource kit to change things in different parts of the world. At the very end of the film, as we see, some of those resources are brought to bear to offset some of the discriminatory practices and some of the life changes that are brought about because of those discriminatory practices in California. And so what I wanted to do in my story is explore very basically what a superpower like Wakanda could do against an enemy like white supremacy, and how it might be handled. And as you see in the story, T'Challa handles it in a very diplomatic manner. And we have an envoy of his, which is a character from the comics who goes by Casper Cole. And if they're comic fans listen to the show, they might recognize his name. He was the Black Panther for a time. He was a replacement Black Panther for T'Challa. And he was gifted, because of his work by T'Challa, the ability to use the heart-shaped herb to augment his physical abilities. He was given vibranium armor and tools to continue carrying on his mission. This character is often pulled in by T'Challa to be a proxy for him in political situations, in situations where, he can't be seen and he can't necessarily use war dogs or other resources. So I wanted to explore how T'Challa with his mind would use one of his most valuable resources to attack and potentially deal with white supremacy, specifically an element of white supremacy that he let fester in the United States, which is my story is very tied to the comics. There's a character in the story that is a reimagining of a character that appeared in a mid 2000s Black Panther run, who was a police officer and was a white supremacist. And so I really wanted to investigate the different perspectives of individuals who are affected by white supremacy, who live in the United States and are of African descent. And it was really important too to show that there needed to be a decisive voice, even if the Wakandan point of view wasn't the decisive one necessarily, right? So just as much as showing that white supremacy is something that we need to deal with, I also wanted to show that there are various perspectives held by Black people about how we deal with racism and white supremacy in this country.
And you did that. You did it in a very powerful way. What I thought might be good if everyone could talk about their coming into this project, because you all have these wonderful stories of how you got to where you are. And I should have mentioned earlier that Black Panther Tales of Wakanda is on sale. It was published in March 9th. And it's just a really wonderfully written anthology, one of the best anthologies I've ever read, because you had the feeling when you read each story that the author put their heart into it. And it's really clear and it's really beautifully done. Whoever would like to start, just a bit of your backstory about how you got involved in this project.
So Mr. Glenn Paris very kindly extended the opportunity to me. He mentioned that Jesse J. Holland was looking for story submissions. And so I connected with him and I gave him my pitch and he said, okay, sounds good. Marvel approved it. So shoot me a draft. And it was a little bit towards the end of the project when they were already starting to prepare for when it would be launched in the spring of this year. And so I actually had a little bit of a tight deadline where I had to turn it in like 3 or 4 days. But given that it was only 5,000 words, which I can knock out in an afternoon, which is not like a flex. It's just, no, I write novels. I've been writing novels for 10 straight years. So you tell me to write 5,000 words, it's like, oh, whatever. Okay, fine. That's easy compared to.
I think we feel you, Kyoko.
I was gonna say, I remember, oh gosh, what was that? I think that was either 2019 or 2018. I was trying to finish, I don't know if it was the second or the third book, but I had procrastinated so hard that I had to finish the rest of the novel in one night in order to hit my deadline. So I wrote 11,000 words in one day.
Whoa.
I will
Whoa.
never do it again because it was
That's
so
actually
stressful.
pretty impressive.
Yeah, but that was why when he said like,
Oh,
write 5,000 words
man.
in 3 days, I was like, oh, okay, well, considering I did that one crazy thing, this is nothing. But that's how I ended up. So I wrote the story and I sent him in the draft, and he sent it on to Marvel and Titan Books and they reviewed it. And then he was like, nope, they like it. And so it was really funny because I have a background in writing fan fiction just for fun, because I love it. I have since I was a kid. And so when I was given this opportunity to write for Marvel, I was like really nervous because I was like, oh gosh, this is like professional writing. I know I've written and published all these books myself. And of course they're professionally edited and I try to make them as professional and high quality as I can. I had all these fears about what they would say when they sent it back to me. And they sent the draft back with one line and nothing else. And I was like, wait, am I that good? What? I don't know. I was expecting red lines everywhere. I thought they were going to tell me all kinds of stuff. They're like, nope, this is perfect. Okay, just change this one line because it's an accidental plot hole. I was like, okay. And I fixed the line and I sent it back. And so that was really fun and cool for me because I really hadn't, I guess I'm very self-deprecating. Anybody who knows me knows that's a huge problem with my personality. And so it was kind of cool to see that they thought it was good enough that it was like, nope, don't change anything. This is fine. I mean, they might have done some surface edits that I didn't notice, but it was on their side, of course. But that was really a proud moment for me. I don't think I had ever considered myself on that level of quality that I would be able to write something that was not only accepted, but I mean, like I said, they had no story edits. They were like, nope, just fix this one line and that's it. And then, they took off with it from there. So, but that's how I ended up in the anthology.
All I can say is, wow.
Thank you.
It's a wonderful story. Glenn, what about yourself?
So I, as everybody knows at this point, I guess I kind of tackled Jesse at a convention when he mentioned this. I mean, I don't even think I let him get the whole sentence out before I was on him with, I want in. So I set to work writing my short story, probably at Dragon Con 2018, 2019, whatever it was. And I got it to him and he had to sit on it for a while because I think he had a list of authors that he intended to put in the first volume. And I think that some of those authors couldn't meet the deadline. So we finally opened mine up. And, I was thrilled when I got his reply. It was just a 2-word reply, you're in. And then later on, he asked me, he says, Glenn, do you know any other writers that you think would be up for something like this? Immediately, I mean, I've only met Kyoko once at a convention, but I've read her material, I've seen her marketing machine, and I said, look, this woman, I don't know her personally. I don't know if she's even interested in doing this, but you need to talk to her. Okay, Kyoko M is somebody that you just need to read some of his stuff. You need to talk to her because she can write. I mean, she can write. So I was thrilled to recommend Kyoko and Milton, and I know a few other indie writers who are phenomenal. I was afraid to submit too many more names because I mean, I'm sort of a rookie. I don't write as well as Kyoko, I think. And I it's like, you can shoot yourself in the foot here, Glenn. You recommend too many great writers and you're out. So, I said, okay, Kyoko, I know if she's got time to do it, she'll do a spectacular job. And the same for Milton. Milton's written a million things. So I knew he could do it. And I'm just sorry that more of my friends who write so incredibly well couldn't be in it. But then again, this was sort of a foot in the door kind of thing, and I'm sure there'll be more opportunities. And I would love to I'd love to collaborate with Kyoko. I'd love to collaborate with Milton. And I read Troy's story a couple of weeks ago, and that was amazing. That was one of the best mashups between a comic book and a novel. But back to how I got into it. I submitted the story before I got any guidelines. So I just I just riffed, on the story. Started with Challenge Day, and I'm very anti-violence, but I do write violence in depth, and I think fairly well. Some of the medical consequences of violence I like to put in. I think too often violence is dismissed as a temporary thing, and then you walk away from it. And too often you really don't completely walk away from a violent encounter. You lose something. There are scars that it's left behind. There are injuries that will never completely heal. As a friend of mine who is a veteran Marine said once, when I asked him about writing a violent passage in my book, I says, I need some realism about hand to hand. And he just kind of sighed and said, hand to hand combat is just so messy. And then he started talking about it. He says, you can get soldiers who are extremely well trained and so well matched. It comes down to somebody grabbing a stick or a rock or a brick in the end. I mean, that's the make or break thing. I thought about, I says, guns, automatic weapons. I said, yeah. Even with all those things, if they're evenly matched, you exhaust all those things, if 4 or 5 different forms of martial arts, it sometimes comes down to something as simple as a rock, a vine that someone trips on, a towel or a necktie that someone uses, or a stray pipe somewhere that someone lands on. I mean, the end of a violent encounter can be so random sometimes. I put that into a lot of my stories, I think.
I wanted to jump in here and say I appreciate that so much because, like I said, my mother's a registered nurse and has been my whole life. And one thing she had to get used to is she would get a random text message from me. Hey, Mom, if you got stabbed right here, what would happen? Like I actually, she's had so many texts of just random injuries because to me it's important, that same thing. Yeah. Like I hate it when you'll watch a movie and like 2 people are punching each other in the face. No one has a bruise, no one has a scrape, no one's, covered in blood, nobody has a concussion, and just things like that. It used to drive me crazy when I would watch things. And so
and the bruise disappeared in 2 scenes.
In 2 seconds. Oh my gosh. Yeah. That was the one that used to drive me.
You'll see the bruise in that scene, you'll see it in the next scene, and the next scene, the 3rd scene, there's no bruise anymore.
It's gone.
Okay.
It's gone.
So okay, absolutely this. Right, one, definitely, I'm excited to hear it because I also, even though it's not really present in this story because it's really superhero-y, and so it's one of those stories where the bruises disappear after a while. Yes, to like really considering how acts of violence and dealing them out and receiving them like sit with people and how that causes trauma, right? That's really important. That said, if you want to see a superhero show that really is like, no, if a guy with super strength punches another guy with super strength, his eyeballs gonna fly out, watch Invincible. Because that's
yes.
Oh,
yes.
I've already heard that much. Yeah, yes. I've heard as much that
I've seen the whole thing.
No.
Yeah, that is gruesome, but it adds a level of realism that you never see in superhero animation, or you begin to see it in Marvel, some of Marvel stuff, but you never see that in the old superhero comic books or animation.
The other thing I wanted to mention, Glenn, that you were right on the nose about is it's psychological too. People forget that, again, because you're so used to watching these implacable action heroes, that after a fight, I mean, there's so many physiological things that change, but that was one thing I dealt with in my Of Cinder and Bone series specifically, is that I had 2 basically normal people with normal backgrounds having to be thrown into a situation that's full of violence and action. And I made sure to show the effects of what that would do to a normal person, because that does drive me a little crazy. Like, they do that a lot in action movies too. They'll have a normal person get thrown into something and they're just like, fine, they're good. They roll with all of the things. I had to kill somebody today, whatever, I'm gonna go to sleep tonight and have no issues. I really wanted to bring that out because it was like, and that was another thing that's important to me is mental health. People are very timid about it still. They don't really want to talk about trauma or things that hurt them. And so I made sure, I think every book so far has had a therapy session. in which the characters reflect on the trauma and what it does to them, because I think it's an extremely important issue that people need to verbalize and normalize as well. So thank you for bringing that up, Glenn. It really is important that, you know, they get in a fight, they're fine afterwards, but they're not fine at the same time.
They're not. I mean, you know, I think there was a line in the movie Roadhouse, no one really wins a fight. I've always loved that line. Because, you know, I've taken care of veterans. I've taken care of, people who have had all kinds of abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. And, you know, they live with that even when they get out of that situation. That emotional psychic scar does not go away. It doesn't go away for decades, I mean. And we send these young people into battle that they really have no stake in going in, and they have to live with that survival, you know, assuming that they come back alive, assuming that they come back physically whole, they still will wake up with nightmares for decades. I'm talking about into their 60s and 70s. I mean, it is really awful. And a lot of them have learned to keep it to themselves. And then, you know, when they get together in these veterans meetings, they can share some of that. And some of it even goes unsaid, but understood among former warriors. I mean, you know, it's a really, really terrible thing. And, you know, I think it gets underplayed in so many video games and such. People think that they want to go to war. They think that they want to do urban warfare. They revel in the destructive power of weapons. And it's really not about that. It really isn't.
One thing I want to mention here, just in small, hopefully not spoiling too much, is I like how the Falcon and the Winter Soldier series explored some of that. I was going to say what really struck me was, again, spoiler alert, turn it off for a few seconds. When John Walker is dismissed, that frustrated speech that he gives of like, I did everything you told me to do. I made myself exactly what you dictated. I made one mistake, you kicked me out, and I'm out on my own forever. And again, all of that trauma from the years and years of excellent service he gave. Now, again, he's still kind of crazy pants, obviously. But at the same time, that was one thing that I was so proud of them for portraying, is that they love to do that. They love to sign you up to go out in the military, do all these awful things. You come back home, no support whatsoever. You're stuck on a list for years at a time trying to get help. And the
whole creation of the super soldier, you know, a super soldier is admired and desired as long as they're a soldier. And the minute they're not, you want to throw them away. And if you can't throw them away, that's a problem that they have to solve. And you saw that with the Carl Lumley character.
Oh, yeah. Excellent point. I wanted to make sure, Troy, how did you go about being a part of the Black Panther Tales of Wakanda? Also, for our audience, Glenn Paris is a Atlanta-based rheumatologist. He knows what he speaks of when he talks about medical issues. So I want to make sure you know that. Go ahead, Troy.
Thank you. And Glenn, thanks so much for those kind words about What's Done in the Dark. I really appreciate it. I haven't made it to your story yet, but I am working my way through the anthology. As you can tell, I'm
right after you.
Okay.
Next story in.
Got you. So I was one of the authors who was invited by Jesse to participate in the anthology to submit story pitches to potentially have a story published in the anthology. And so one thing about me is I am a longtime Marvel fan. And I am also a fan of the type of Marvel stories that center people who deal with that violence. And so, Kyoko, that was a really awesome callback to Falcon and the Winter Soldier, because one of the things I appreciated was how much it leaned into the Falcon as a character's actual profession. He's a social worker, he's a counselor. And so the movies and the show did a good job of leaning into the fact that, like, hey, this is a brother who has gone to war, who has seen these really traumatic things, who decided to have a military occupation that actually had him rescuing people from violent situations and taking care of them until, you know, they could become more stable, get more stable medical treatment and more, you know, care. And so that was a really cool thing to see them lean into in their story. But I'm a longtime fan of these kinds of stories. And so I have written a Black Panther screenplay. It's actually on my blog. My blog is afrofantasy.wordpress.com. It is a kind of a, so I'll just explain it. It is a mashup of a Tyler Perry play and a Black Panther. And it was really my kind of like real hope and wish that we didn't get the wrong creative minds behind the film. You know what I mean? Like, Hollywood can pick some really interesting people to helm these projects. And so what I wanted to like talk about in the screenplay was like, I hope we don't get, somebody with like problematic worldviews or problematic, ideas of Africans and African content and Africanness. I hope we have someone at the head of this project who is really respectful of all the things that we need to think about. And we got that, right? But I also have written critically about Black Panther, about Wakanda. Also on my blog, you can read my take on the Black Panther movie. I've spoken to several magazines about the problem with Wakanda, the problem with a lot of the different aspects, political and social aspects of having a nation like that. And so when Jesse reached out and was like, hey, you are welcome to pitch a few ideas. I pitched like 4 because I was very excited to play around with all this stuff. And, he came back to me and he was like, this idea is one that really speaks to us. And it was the one that honestly will require the most research. It was the one that will require me to go back and read a bunch of comics. And it was the one that I was most excited to write about. So I submitted the pitch for What's Done in the Dark, which, would revive all of these different characters from the comics and place them in these different situations. It took me a few months to write it because I'm also currently working on drafting a novel as well, and so I had to take some time to write a novel. I'm also no longer the editor, but the publisher of Fire magazine of Black speculative fiction. And so there's some responsibility that come with that too. So I was juggling a lot of stuff. It took me a while to write it. And it ended up being like 3,000 words over the list. So, there's a lot going on with that. But we were able to get it down. Jesse gave me a lot of insight as to what would work with Marvel's editors and what wouldn't, especially for my story because it was based on the comics so specifically. And we were given the directive to focus to use the comics continuity more than the film continuity. And so I leaned into that. And because I use comic book stories, there were a lot of continuity things that we had to work out between me and the Marvel editors. One of the names of one of the characters, one of the groups had to change in the story because there was already a group in the comics that used their name. I didn't even know about them. I'm a long-time Marvel Comics nerd. I didn't know about these people. I was like, can we just not publish? Can we just remove these folks from the Marvel canon so my people can be, the people? But it was a real cool process. I had some read from the Marvel editors. They were like, this is actually called this now. They went to space, so this guy doesn't exist. Stuff like that. But it was really cool to have folks who knew that lore, give me some correction to help me understand it. And also, I haven't read a Marvel comic book in a long time, in part because the stories aren't really for me anymore. In that there is a different audience that Marvel should be focusing on right now, and that audience is children, young people, young creatives who are coming up, who are looking at Marvel, who grew up with the Marvel movies, and who are really thirsty for those kinds of stories. Marvel has a lot of work to do to make those stories respectful of those young people, these new fans, and they should be speaking to these young fans. Not every piece of media has to continue to speak to the people who was old fans. That's my belief. And even though I wrote a story that is very, very much speaks to the old fans, I also really wanted to take and do some new things with these old concepts. And so luckily, I did not get too many slaps on the wrist from the Marvel editors. I did get a couple, but that's how the process goes. And I was very fortunate that, they rocked with my story and were, willing to publish it in the anthology. And so, that's how I got in. And that some of the other ideas, again, speaking directly to the comics continuity, was a follow-up story from Ta-Nehisi Coates' recent run on Black Panther. Kind of a vignette style story, checking in with some of the characters from that run and seeing kind of what they felt like, and also like people who witnessed Wakanda's growth and evolution, like so kind of like a documentary style like story. And then there was a story, about meeting Captain America, because you have to have that like Black Panther Captain America meeting, the ideological like meeting of the minds and the body, so to speak. And then there was another idea that I can't remember, which must mean it wasn't very good. So, but yeah, that's my path. I'm still really excited. It's still a really surreal feeling to be a part of an anthology of a character that I have grown up reading, critiquing, appreciating, loving, hating at times. You know what I mean? It's really spectacular. And for me as a writer, a real blessing and a real, I don't know, just kind of a dream come true.
Thank you, Troy. And I love what you had to say, because one of the things that's very important, the Black Panther was started in 68, I think, I'm not sure. And it was Stan Lee. And so it wasn't created by an African American, but yet we have taken over. I believe we have put our stamp on, as African American writers, on this character. Not me, of course, but you all, because it's very clear that the issues that are faced in the African American community are really being brought out in the Black Panther, not only the comic books, but also the movies. And can you speak about, was there any did you all, like Glenn, did you and Kyoko and Troy, did you go back and actually read some of the Black Panther comic books to get any character ideas or see how the characters were used?
Yeah.
Like, for instance, Kyoko Okoye, she has a very, very definite character. Did you find the difference in her character? Was there a difference to you in her character? There was strong African woman in the comics as opposed to the movie. Did you see a difference in that, in her character?
I did. Unfortunately, I don't have the list in front of me. I had to basically sign up for Comixology, I think is the name of the website, to do some browsing and get a good idea. And then I did like an overview of like the Wikipedia, the different entries they have on stories that focused on Okoye. What was interesting that I noticed is, like I said, I think at one point she was considered his wife or something similar. It might have been in a love interest context. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Because in the film, she's strictly the general. There's not really that type of relationship between them. It was actually, you know what? That does remind me of a different story. I had the pitches, and I think there was maybe 3 ideas I had. One of them was about Nakia, until I read in the comics, Nakia is not at all the way she's portrayed in the film, at least, based on the comics or the list of comics I read about her character. So that was an interesting change. And I mean, I could see for what the story that they went with, why they would do that, but it was like, blew my mind. I was like, oh no, I didn't know that. So I kind of struck Nakia's story from there, because I was like, oh, there's all this context I don't have, and I would need to go in and read it all before I would try to tackle that. But like I said, I think the difference between Okoye is removing that aspect of it, where there wasn't an attraction or there wasn't a, like I said, I want to say that may have been an arranged marriage or something to that degree. It did have an impact on how I wrote her and how I think that their relationship was, because I did allow her a little bit more softness in her 2 scenes that she has with T'Challa, based on that comic continuity. It wasn't quite as straightforward and platonic as it was in the film. So I think that was a difference for me.
I think it's interesting, Kyoko, that you were able to make that like sort of transformation from what's going on in your head, what's actually going on. I find this conversation so interesting because I come from a whole different perspective as how I see it. And I'll say that you're talking about like Black people, the Black image finally becoming part of like Marvel Comics. I go back a long way, because I can tell you that I think it might have been like 1990. I might get the year wrong, where I was actually, I'm not a big comic book person, but I kind of observe it almost as, I look at it in a scientific way and a sociological way, because I never was a big comic book person, but around like 1990, I was asked to model for a comic book character because I was doing some business in advertising with a man that actually did illustrations, did the drawings for Marvel and DC Comics. He asked me to put on like a lab jacket, like a doctor, and model for a character that was Black back then, Dr. Sarah somebody. And she was a doctor in this comic, and there had been an explosion. So he asked me to go into a mall. I'm just putting this out there. I want to put it in your heads and see what you're thinking now. Go into a mall, and he posed me, and he said for me to make certain facial expressions, and he took pictures of it, okay, and then he finished the comic. So it's very fascinating to me to hear how far all of this has come. Now, all of a sudden, we're talking about Black superhero. That didn't exist that I knew of. That didn't exist back then, or they weren't talking about it. So it seems like there was an evolution of Blackness being in comics. I don't know what you think about that, but I just had to say it. I've been like dying to say it.
That is really
They're talking
interesting.
about it like it's brand new, and it's not brand new to me, even though I'm not a comics book enthusiast.
Yeah, one of the things, and I appreciate that, Tony. One of the things that used to turn me off to a lot of anime is the stereotypical African American look. You know, they all look the
Oh
same.
yes.
Yeah, they all look the same. You know, and you go from one series to the next, to the next, to the next, one character to the next. They grow up, they always look the same. Every once in a while, they put a little extra weight on somebody, but the eyes were always the same. The distance between them was always the same. The nose was always the same. The lips were always the same. The expressions were always the same. You know,
They all had afros. Like,
yeah,
wow.
they had afros, or they had fades. But the thing was that they all had the same physique, same proportions. You know, there's no sense of variety. And I think that when I don't know how everybody formulates characters, but I pick somebody, and you know, it might be a famous actor, it might be somebody I see in a commercial, it might be somebody I see in a mall, it might be someone that I work with, but I sort of start out with that character. And once I have the voice of that character, the look of that character, the height of the character, the build of the character, I keep that in mind with every line that I write for that character. And that character stays very true to the character that I've built. You know, and I may make a character Bible, you know, with backstory and stuff, but I rarely have to dig into it very much.
Tony, if I could, I like to speak to that too. I think that one, that's really awesome that you had that experience, like to be photographed and rendered artistically in that way. With regard to Blackness in comics, so one thing that's really interesting is that there have been Black people in graphic stories for a very long time, but the key distinction that makes a lot of Black readers, just like I imagine any other affinity group or identity group of people who consume a type of media. What makes it really difficult for people to engage with was the fact that there were no people who actually shared that identity really involved in the telling of those stories. So like with regard to comics, there weren't a lot of, in mainstream comics, the comics we think about like as when we think about comic books right now, like Marvel and DC, those companies, there weren't a lot of Black creators at those comics until the 70s, 80s. Even though they were telling stories about black heroes, Black villains, etc. Since the 40s or 50s, there weren't any Black people writing about it, and definitely no Black women writing about them until very late in the game. And so those characters always came off flat. One of the most hilarious questions that someone has asked about Black characters in comics comes from my friend Fenderson J. Lee Clark, who asked what fraternity, so what Black fraternity would John Stewart, who is the Green Lantern, a DC character, who is this really straight-laced Marine Black guy, what fraternity would he have pledged? You know what I mean? And like, it really takes a Black person to think of an African-American person to think about those kinds of human nuances that come with an experience like the ones we have, right? And when you don't have those people telling those stories, or even in the room coming up with these characters, all that nuance is lost. And people often replace it with stereotypes, with very lazy characterizations like the ones that that Glenn speaks to, and it's really as interesting in anime because again, as insular as American comics are, we know that that's like in large part to like racism. But like with anime, they weren't consulting Black people. They just were like telling it was a cultural perspective. But that I think is a big part of why nowadays, especially, these Black superheroes, one, are more in the public eye, and two, seem like they're more worth engaging with, and it's because there are people of color, there are queer people, there are neurodivergent people. There are people who share these identities of these characters who are involved in their creation, who are involved in telling their stories, who are involved in shaping them and shaping the world they live in. And that was a critical aspect of what was missing, especially before the 70s, 80s, and 90s, when a lot of Black creators, and primarily Black cisgender men, were able to break into the industry and start telling their stories. And when they were, we started to see universes that were more diverse, like Milestone, which is now a kind of a subsidiary of DC Comics, where in all of the stories in those universes were by and about people of color, very more inclusive relatively than the stories we saw coming out of the larger comic book companies.
And I just wanted to jump here and say that one thing that's really been cool for me is a writer by the name of Joffrey Thorne. He went to high school with my dad and they were friends. And he linked me up to him years and years ago. And I thought it was really cool because he started, so again, he was working on the Black Panther animated series. And I think he still might be, but it's been really cool because he is now working on the Green Lantern comic currently. And so that was really great for me to see, just because he's been putting in work forever. He's been in TV writing and different show running things. But this was really a huge thing for him because he's getting to write John Stewart. And it was really, really cool because personally, that's the Lantern a lot of people in my age group in particular are more familiar with than Hal Jordan.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it was like a dream come true for him and for me to just be like in the background, like waving my little pom-poms of like, go Joff! Because he's getting to write that experience and he has this amazing resume. But again, that experience as a Black man and as a Black geek was really important to get to see him writing that main continuity. And I really hope that it continues to expand out and eventually maybe we can convince Hollywood to stop going back to Hal Jordan. Because I mean, really, like I said, most of the people in my age range watched the incredible Justice League series and read Dwayne McDuffie's incredible work and things like that. So, I mean, they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot if they keep running back to Hal Jordan in terms of, and not, jumping on this incredible story, this incredible character of John Stewart, who, like I said, I think is very relatable and it has been enjoyable, whether it's in the comics or whether people know him from the animated series. So I just wanted to throw that out there to Mr. Thorne. You're out there doing your thing, man.
We don't have that much time left, but I wanted to get all of your responses to how do young people break into this business? What do you need to do to get a leg up? What do you need to do to find your voice or to find the mentors that can help you have your work be seen? Do you want to start, Kyoko?
Sure. So I kind of accidentally stumbled into this. I went to school to be a vet. I was halfway through my undergrad and I was like, oh my God, I love science, but I don't love it this much. I don't want to do this. And so I switched to journalism and I did that for a semester. And I was like, it's kind of boring. I don't really want it that much. And then again, I had been writing my entire life, but didn't think it was an actual career. Don't ask me why. But this, keep in mind, I'm 32. So this was back in like the friggin' early 2000s. And I went to a lecture by one of the UGA alumnus named Jackson Pierce. And she did a lecture on publishing. And I attended that just out of the blue because I had just switched my major to English writing. Because again, even though I didn't really know what I wanted to do, I was like, well, I love writing. I love reading. I get to take classes on all these really neat books and things like that. And so when I went to her lecture, she talked about the actual career path of being an author and getting published. And so after she did that, I started I started 2 books. One of them went unfinished. The other ended up being The Black Parade later on. And so I shot my book for probably about 2 years trying to find a query agent. And it didn't work out. I mean, I'm sorry, literary agent, excuse me. And nothing came of it. And I was like, okay, well, maybe this isn't what I need to do. And my dad suggested self-publishing because at that point it was the late 2010s. And self-publishing had started to finally like make this very solid climb into being more, not legitimate. It was always legitimate. But again, people were taking notice of self-published authors more. And he's like, well, why don't you try that? And I was like, sure, okay. So I did a whole bunch of research for about a year. And then I put my book out and it didn't really go that well. But the thing that I found in, which again, I can thank Mr. Thorne for, is that I stumbled across this forum called Kboards, which has a writer's cafe on it. And that has probably the most resources for new authors, because pretty much any subject you can think of, somebody's posted about it and other people have discussed it. I always recommend that to new authors just because it's like I said, it's very condensed. It has most of the things that you would need to learn on it, from starting a draft all the way up to finishing it and getting it published. That's where I learned the majority of my work. In terms of getting it in front of other people, doing things like this, so participating in panels or going to Q&As or going to lectures like I ended up doing, that really helps, because if you the more you network, the more you know, the better you get. So that's my suggestion. I'm going to put it here in the chat, but it's Kboards Writers Cafe. And that's what I use for a lot of my research, things like that.
This is excellent. I will actually put it up on Facebook as a suggestion for writers, because we need to support, so it's a wonderful way of giving back to the community. So I love that. What about you, Glenn? And thank you so much, Kyoko. Thank you.
I think that fortune favors the best prepared. So, again, I started writing late in life. Compared to Kyoko, I started writing around 36 or so. And I didn't know anything about writing. I didn't have a background in English literature. I didn't have an MFA. I came from a science background. I, went through medical school and residency and fellowship. And, I was accustomed to reading medical journal articles and that sort of thing. But I loved science fiction and read a lot of that. And I was hungry for it, because I was in a situation where I found myself with a lot of time on my hands, and I didn't have anything to read. So I started making stuff up, and I started thinking, if I can't read something that I like to read, then maybe I can write something that I like to read. And that's how I came up with my first stories. And, like Kyoko, I've got a couple that I never did develop, but I kept them, and I sort of collect turns of phrases for titles and titles of chapters and such. And it's just the style that I write. It just keeps me on track. But just keep writing and keep learning. Get feedback from other writers. Get feedback from teachers on writing technique, so that you don't see as much blood on the page when you get it back from an editor. But just keep writing. And if you get something picked up, people then start looking at your back catalog. They start looking at what else did you write. And it also gives you a shortcut to when they say, okay, this is great. We need you to do something else in 6 months. Not everybody is a dynamo like Kyoko. So 11,000 pages in a couple of days. I mean, I'm still stunned by that. But if you have something to start with, you can put together a project in a few months, at least enough to send to a publisher to know that you're serious. So just keep writing. Don't throw anything away. Maybe you can come back to it, months later, years later. Time passes fast. I mean, when I first started doing this in 1993, I didn't think that I'd still be writing, almost 28 years later, but, here we are. But, I still have some of those manual scribbles of ideas that I had from back then, and so many more. But just keep writing, go to workshops, ask writers. Writers are incredibly generous. You know, I still talk about Octavia Butler, and it wasn't until I started reading a book that she recommended that I read 25 years ago that I realized she actually read my crappy first draft novel 25 years ago, and she read it to the end because she actually analyzed it and critiqued it and compared it with another book. And I did not realize that she did that until I read the book that she recommended. And I'm still astounded at you know, at her genius and how
That is such an honor. Congratulations. That is really, really cool. You should definitely treasure that forever. That's awesome.
You have no idea. You have no idea. You know, that and kicking myself for not staying in touch with her as much as I think I should have.
That's still really cool. And that's one thing I'll add before we jump to Troy. I'm sorry. So in my profile, there's one correction I wanted to make. I haven't been reviewed by the New York Times. I was reviewed by Ilana Andrews, who is a New York Times best-selling author. Oh, I know, it's a big deal. So, and it's completely a coincidence. So I was on Twitter just messing around and there was this issue that came up and she, I guess, saw my reply, looked me up, read the Black Parade and was like, wow, this is great. I want to post about it on my blog. And I'm just staring at her like, I'm sorry, what did you just say? You're literally my favorite author ever. You looked up my profile, read my whole book, and then want to promote me. She actually sent me her phone number and we had a phone call that weekend. And she talked to me about my writing and what she wanted to do for the blog post. But I mentioned that again, not as a flex. It's important to also assist other writers. If you get the opportunity, you never know what can happen from it. But again, it's very important that this community helps each other out and get, you know, I always firmly believe that it doesn't matter where you are in the process, whether you're a millionaire or whether you're not making any money at all. Always, always assist everyone else because you never know what that opportunity can be and how you can inspire someone else to continue writing and you know, continue their career.
Great advice.
Troy, you want to say a couple of words?
Yeah. First of all, fantastic, Kyoko and Glenn. Like, dang. These kinds of experiences, where you know get to meet a person who's created the seminal work, not just like for your genre, but for you personally. Like, that's fantastic. That is actually one of the most awesome parts of being a writer, is to be able to meet writers you admire and have them be real human with you and tell you things and give you advice about how to succeed. And I think to Kyoko's point, it is really imperative as a writer, and I think as any kind of creative, but we are all writers and we're talking about being writers. So as writers, to really pay that kind of energy forward to other writers. But I'll be really brief. There are only a few things that I would tell an up and coming writer to really not guarantee their success in the field, because that's not something they have control over, but to guarantee that they are creating work that really speaks to what they want to do. And to Glenn's point and to Toni Morrison's point, to write the stories that they want to see in the world, because those stories don't exist yet. And so really, the first thing is you gotta write, bruh. Like, you have to actually like
sit down.
Right. You have to put yes, you have to put words on the page at a pace that is consistent and doable for you. There's been a lot of, especially when I was coming up as a writer, I didn't start writing until graduate school. I was actually a visual artist for years before I decided to start writing. I didn't start writing until graduate school in 2009. And it was 4 years before I got anything published, any short fiction. And I spent all 4 of those years, whenever I was not, messing around at SPSS, or whenever I wasn't, transcribing interviews, I was writing fiction. And you have to have that level of like dedication to the actual craft and the work of writing. And to the second point, which is related to that, is you have to feed yourself as a creative. This means you have to read books. You have to engage with powerful stories that speak to you. You have to gain a critical eye for narrative, for character, for plot, for prose, for language, for all kinds of elements of storytelling. And this is important because if you don't feed yourself as a writer, your work will be derivative and it will not have the impact and the humanity and the power that you want it to have. So you have to feed yourself as a writer. I make a list every year of all the things that are coming out or all the things that I've missed that I want to revisit because I know those stories are going to be fire. And so every year I read those things, I engage with those stories, I watch those TV shows, I watch those films, and I feed myself as a writer. Because that helps me. I see things. I'm reading a book now. I'm reading C.L. Clarke's The Unbroken. I'm not gonna cuss. It's fantastic. And I'm learning a lot about how to tell this kind of story. How to write a protagonist that we want readers to be sympathetic to, even though they might be wrong in their worldview, you know? And I think you can only learn that by engaging the story. The next thing is, as you're writing, Glenn made this exact point. Even if you're getting published, don't stop creating things. I was fortunate, so I'll share I'll share my quick story about meeting a writer celebrity that I admire a lot. I got to have breakfast with Ken Liu at a book convention. Shout out to conventions in Arkansas. And Ken Liu, we were eating breakfast, the hotel breakfast. It was regular eggs and pancakes. And he was like, "Work on your backlog. Keep writing stories. Don't throw those stories away. Work on them. Get them to, if you can, get them to a point where they might be." Workable. And when people ask you for things, send those things out. So yeah, keep your old work on it. Don't give up on an idea unless it's just like not working. And have strive to create a backlog of ideas and stories that you could build one day. And then the last thing, this is the point Kyoko already made, and I'll just reiterate it, be in community with other writers, especially for writers who are specific identities. It's important that you engage with writers who share your identity and also writers who have different identities from you, because one, you don't want to represent the quote unquote the other in a way that would be traumatic or disrespectful of them, right? And there are resources on that. Nisi Shaw, and I forget the co-author of Writing the Other. Forgive me for that if you all hear this, but like that's a really good resource to learning how to engage meaningfully with experiences that you don't share in your work. And also being in community for me as a Black man is really important. And I'm in community with Black women writers, with women of color, with writers of other races and ethnicities, with writers with other gender identities, and writers of other ability. All of those things are important because one day I might want to, I need to be in community with those people because I need to understand how to best support them and be in community with them. And also, if I want to write a character who shares that identity, I need to have had experiences with those people and be able to, reach out and say, hey, I'm writing this character. Can you look over it for me and tell me, if I'm messing up anything, or if there's anything that's not true to your experience or the experience that you might have. And I think it's really important to that. And those are really all of my pieces of advice for someone who might be looking to break into this industry, because really you can only do what you can control. The industry is going to do what it does. You just have to make sure you work and be in community in the ways that you know how.
If I can add one thing, there's an advantage that every unpublished writer has over published writers, particularly traditionally published writers: time. When you're an unpublished writer, you have unlimited time to fine tune and refine your work. You can take 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever it is. When you're a traditionally published writer, your publisher wants you to write something every 6 months, every 12 months. The pressure is always on. If you're an indie writer, you don't want to lose your audience. You have a marketing campaign, you build an audience. You can't let that iron go cold. You've got to get something else out within the next 6 months to a year. You've got to really churn. So when you're an unpublished author, you can refine your work, you can rewrite your work, you can rename your characters, you can take that failed idea that you had and use that shard in another work that you've got, so you can combine things. You've got all kinds of advantages as an unpublished author, because what you see, no one else will see until you're ready to show it.
Excellent point, Glenn. Well, I want to thank you all, Glenn Paris, Kyoko M. Troy Wiggins, and remind our audience to please pick up Black Panther Tales of Wakanda, edited by Jesse Holland. And also check out the other works. Check out Glenn's work. It's in Glenn. Can you name give them, well, everyone, can you give them our audience just a couple of places where they can find your work so they can learn more about you as authors?
Mine is very simple, glennparis.com for my writing work. And my first published novel under my name is The Renaissance of Aspirin. It's about an African-American medical scientist who discovers a cure for a very painful condition. The pharmaceutical company that she works for wants to secure their stake in it and learn what she has learned. And it's a sort of a chase story. It takes place in Atlanta, and it's the first of the mystery doc series. My other works are short fiction, which is very difficult for me. You know, as Milton and Kyoko know, I have trouble with brevity. So I did write a short story in Where the Veil is Thin, a story called The Tooth Fairy's Quest for Tear Haven. And it's about a band of miniature vampires called Tooth Fairies who are trying to get a tooth out of a little girl's head before dawn, and she won't open her mouth. I wrote Unbitten, A Vampire Dream, which is about a vampire who, after 200 years, she finds that she's almost dead, not completely dead, and finds a way back. And I throw a little bit of medicine in there to give you a little wrinkle on the whole vampire vibe there. And then finally, my main course, Dragon's Heir, which is the first book in the Ifilu legacy. And that's coming out from Outland Entertainment, hopefully later on this year, about, again, a female. It seems like all my main characters are female, but a female main character who is sort of, oddly enough, Panther-esque in her physique, but of dinosaurian origin. She is an archaeologist who ends up coming back on an expedition to Earth to find that it's not a dead husk for exploration, but actually a vibrant living world with mammals that evolved to look like her and her people.
Whoa, that's crazy. I like it.
It's sort of an allegory of, you know, what if there were people like us from millions of years ago that have never been conquered, and they're looking now at Western civilization with the eye of superiority and invincibility almost.
Wow. I want to hear more
Yep.
about that someday soon. I do.
I'd like to come back and talk about it sometime.
Absolutely. You guys are great. I have to say that this turned out to be, I knew it was going to be really good, but I didn't know that it was going to be so intriguing and so mind bending. You know, I always like talking to people that do something sort of like what I do, but different, you know, and I really appreciate everybody. And thank you, Kim, for bringing everybody together. You know, it's amazing what we do. You know, it really is. I could go on and I won't, but I always go out of these things like kind of awestruck, you know, by what everybody does. And I really appreciate, because I know like where you are, Kim, it's like the crack of dawn. This was really, really good. I appreciated this. Thank you, Kim, for bringing everybody together. Thank you, Kyoko. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Troy. You know, I feel like I've known you guys my whole life, and I could talk about it forever. We'll do this again.
I'm probably prejudiced. I think these authors are brilliant. Before we go, Kyoko and Troy, you want to mention one or two of your books or your website so people can check out your work?
Mm-hmm.
Certainly. So my work can be found at shewhowritesmonsters.com. That's got everything that I've ever pretty much produced, all centralized at the website. So I have two series. The first one is the Black Parade series, which is about an Afro-Latina waitress who has to help 100 souls cross over to the other side or she's going to hell. She bumps into this very troublesome poltergeist named Michael as her very last case before her deadline. And it basically causes her to stumble into the path of a very, very mean archdemon named Belial, who wants her for himself. And so she's got to struggle to finish Michael's case in time before her soul is damned, and also try to avoid this very bloodthirsty vain demon at the same time. And then I've got the Of Cinder and Bone series, which is my current one, which is the one I described earlier, which is a science fiction contemporary fantasy series about if dragons were real and were brought back. It is a bit of a love letter to Jurassic Park in a way, but not in an exploitive way, in talking about how man, nature, God, all of that fits in together. And just, like I said, the harmony between science and humanity and the environment at large. And so that's currently got 4 books out. I'm writing the 5th one right now for publication in 2022. The other 2 projects I'll mention is, so Milton Davis and I are in 2 different anthologies now, thanks to him being a brilliant, brilliant collaborator. We've got one called Terminus. Terminus is an anthology that's science fiction based around Atlanta. So every single story is written as a sci-fi or fantasy premise outside of, that takes place in some place in Atlanta, Georgia. So that's available if you go to MV Media. You can Google MV Media, you'll see it there. The second one is the one that just came out last month. It's called Cyberfunk. And so that is another one that's an anthology written by Black authors, and it's specifically about science fiction. The other one is both sci-fi and fantasy. This one is science fiction and it's cyberpunk based.
I'll be really brief to talk about where you can find my work. So I'm Troy Wiggins, Troy L. Wiggins. My name on Twitter, Instagram, and everywhere else is Troy L. Wiggins. If you want to find me there, I primarily write short fiction. On the writer side of my work, I primarily write short fiction. You can find links to it at my website, troylwiggins.com, or at afrofantasy.wordpress.com, which is my long-time blog I started writing in grad school. And I'm also the publisher of Fire Magazine of Black Speculative Fiction, which is a quarterly release magazine that publishes science fiction, fantasy, horror only by writers of African descent. We also host the annual FireCon, which is in the 2nd year, which will be happening in September, which is really centers Black, Indigenous, and people of color creators. And I also want to shout out Milton Davis, who is an amazing person and published my very first short story in the Griot Sisters of the Spirit anthology way back in 2012 or 2013. Really, really amazing guy. Him and the late, great Charles Saunders were the editors of the anthology. And it was a fantastic experience working with both of them. And those are all of my thanks.
Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Tony.
You guys were great. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Kyoko. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Troy. You guys are amazing. And we'll talk again. We will talk again. This was very, very good. And thank you for allowing me to co-host it. I appreciate that.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you.
My pleasure, 100%. Okay, everybody, I'm going to say goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Have a great day.
Great weekend, everyone.